I'm Ramona Salgado from Colorado Springs. I'm a peer chaplain for the Mountain Desert District. I'm Hispanic, queer, able-bodied, and I'm here to talk to you all about preparing to caucus. I myself have participated in several race caucuses and 2 gender caucuses. So, for those of you who haven't caucused before or don't know what caucusing is, it's when people with shared identities come together to discuss a common purpose and create a course of action that will reflect their shared values. These mutually identifying groups are usually separate between minority and majority groups. But with this in mind, we must remember that we are very much multi-identity beings.
Friends, may I have your attention, please? Friends, may I have your attention, please? May I invite you to be seated? May I invite you to find seats as quickly as possible? Before our keynote address this morning, we have a few very brief announcements from our Right Relations team.
Can you hear us? Good morning. I'm Hayden from the Right Relations team. And some folks are going to introduce themselves in a moment. So my announcement is that some of us have been looking for stairs so that we could use the stairs and leave the elevators open for others. And every floor has stairs that are a fire escape that take you downstairs and probably outside, and you can't get back in. There is one staircase that will let you go upstairs. It goes only up to floor 9. And please pay attention. This staircase is right next to the main elevators over there. It is just to the left of the elevators, and it says employees only. And the hotel staff has given us permission to use those stairs if you would like those stairs.
And I'm Crystal Zerfas, also on the Right Relation team. And you may have noticed that there has been some movement in the room in here. We have intentionally gone back into what we had agreed to do for folks here and create spaces all throughout the room for wheelchairs and scooters to be comfortably positioned in the room. And we ask that as you break out into your smaller groups in other rooms, the room should be set up this way, but if there is not space available for scooters and wheelchairs, to please create that space for yourself. And when you're in your small groups and you're moving around, maybe circling up, be aware and make space for everyone to participate. One of the things that on the Right Relationship team we do is when we make mistakes, we find that it's important to name those mistakes, take responsibility for our actions and the ways that maybe we have not done the best that we could do, and then change our behavior and do better. So we ask everyone to join us in that. The other thing is you may notice on your name tag that we do not have our pronouns listed there. So I would ask that you take your name tag out, use your pen or a pen of your neighbor, and please put the pronouns that you use on the bottom of your name tag so that we can identify one another when we're talking to each other and know what our pronouns are. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Rowland. I also serve on the Right Relations team, and my announcement is about one of my favorite topics, food. And I do need to start out with an apology that we did not communicate adequately that there was a need for vegan options at breakfast and lunch yesterday, and so we're very sorry about that, particularly for the people who did not get fed this morning. So we have spoken with staff, and there will be dairy-free, gluten-free, and vegan options at lunch and at dinner. But if you should find that you're not finding the food that you need and you need extra accommodations, the useful path to take in that situation would be to ask for the banquet captain or the team lead who's on duty at that the table area where you are, and tell them what your request is. And they will get in touch with us and the kitchen, and we will do everything we can to make sure that everyone gets fed. So thank you for your understanding. And again, we apologize for the mistakes this morning, and enjoy your day here.
I'm Samantha Gupta, and I have nothing more to tell you. Thank you. Yet. Relationship is a practice that we move towards all the time. So if there are any more concerns or noticings that help us be in right relationship with each other, we say, bring it on. Thank you so much.
My friends, I am so very pleased to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Pramila Jayapal. Congresswoman Jayapal is a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for the 114th Congress and represents Washington State's 7th District. She is the first Indian American woman in the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Jayapal came to Congress after a long career as a community organizer, empowering and mobilizing communities to fight for comprehensive immigration reform, living wages, women's health, and civic engagement. She is a founder of One America, Washington's largest immigrants' rights organization, and a former state senator. She successfully challenged the Bush administration against the illegal deportation of Somali immigrants, registered 23,000 new Americans to vote, and played a major role in helping to pass Seattle's $15 per hour minimum wage. She brings this fighting spirit to the other Washington, where she is a vice-ranking member of the House Budget Committee, where she sits on the influential Judiciary Committee, and is first vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. In her first term, she was listed on CNN's list of seven women to watch in 2018, and named one of Trump's most fearless opponents by Mother Jones magazine. She is committed. She is committed to ensuring that every resident of her district has economic opportunity, fairness and equity, and safe and healthy communities. My friends, please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. This is a room that is going to fill my soul, I can tell already. And I really want to thank Dr. James Kobol-Komoto. I want to thank Reverend Susan Frederick Gray
And I want to thank you all for having me here and for being the fierce advocates, champions, fighters for justice that you are. This community, I know for many years, and I'll talk about how I first came to really work with the UUA community, but I am so proud of what you're doing. James was telling me about how many of your congregations are serving as sanctuary congregations. Thank you for doing that. At great risk, I know. And I know that many of you are standing in solidarity at the border, going to Charlottesville, taking on the challenges that are before us. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am to be in this fight with all of you. So please give yourselves a round of applause. And many of you probably don't know the story. I just found out most people that I in the organizing team didn't know the story of how I first came to the UUAs. And so I will tell you that story as I tell you my story, a little bit of my story. It was 17 years now in the wake of 9/11 as we saw these terrible, initially hate crimes by individuals against other individuals simply because they were wearing hijab or turbans or came from another country and somehow were associated with the 9/11 terrorists, that I ended up starting the organization that was then called Hate Free Zone, later became One America, now the largest immigrant advocacy organization in Washington State, one of the largest in the country, that I had the privilege to lead for 12 years. It was 17 years ago, and just after I got my US citizenship, which took me 17 years to get, an alphabet soup of visa. So for anyone who thinks that it's easy to get citizenship, I got another story to tell. And this was my new country that I had just sworn allegiance to, that I saw the government targeting people's liberties and rights simply because, again, they were Muslim or Arab American. And I knew I couldn't sit idle while that happened. And it was 17 years ago that I had just moved into a new home in Seattle on September 10th, 2001. And I was still in boxes. And believe it or not, the only TV I had was about this big. And it was in a box. And I remember getting a call from a friend of mine in New York City who was watching the TV early in the morning and telling me what was happening, and then suddenly being flooded with calls from my South Asian and Muslim and Arab American friends around Seattle who were being attacked physically and verbally simply because fearful people had turned their anger against the hijackers towards peaceful people in the country. Teachers who were calling me because the Muslim families in their schools were withdrawing their children from school because they were too afraid to go to school. And it was 17 years ago when I felt despondent about where we were, but I decided that I had to dry my tears and brush away the personal fear I felt about being a brown immigrant woman and move to action. And so from that kitchen table, within weeks, we had pulled together incredible coalitions of longtime leaders in immigrant communities, in faith communities, in labor, so many different groups of people who knew that we could be much more than we were at the time. And yes, we successfully sued the Bush administration, something that people said couldn't be done, and stopped the deportation around of 4,000 Somalis across the country. And since we're talking about sanctuary cities, within a couple of years of 9/11, I was so proud to have helped establish Seattle as one of the first sanctuary cities in the country to allow everybody, regardless of their citizenship status, to seek the services they needed, to not get stopped by police and turned over to ICE agents, because we know who we are as a welcoming country. And it was a year after the 9/11 attacks that this big coalition of people wanted to mark that day of September 11th in a different way and tell different stories, tell the fuller stories of those who were being deported and detained simply because of their country of origin or their religion. And so we decided to hold the first ever Justice for All hearing in Seattle, an occasion to bring the voices and the stories of Muslims, Arab Americans, immigrants to the forefront of the conversation, to allow people, everybody, to get to know those people who were being targeted for hate, to remind everyone that the them in the Bush administration's us versus them at the time were our sisters, our neighbors, our friends. To hear how the stories of the past, the stories of the Japanese internment, the civil rights movement, the exclusion of Polish and Irish and Chinese immigrants related to the reality of the present. The kids who were being bullied, the 1,200 Arab American men who were being secretly disappeared and detained, the Muslims who were being shackled with no evidence except their religions, and how all of this violated our vision for the future, our vision of hope and courage, of dissent being patriotic, of justice for all and not just some. And I can tell you, we had no idea what that first hearing would be like. People were afraid, and they were fighting the urge to acquiesce with their silence. And this hearing was the first of its kind. We actually got a panel of elected officials. And you have to understand, I had never done anything in politics before. I had been an activist on international health and development for 10 years before that, working overseas, but really not in politics here, not challenging the US government as a brand new citizen. But we got a panel of elected officials from the federal, state, and local levels to sit and listen for 2 hours to these very carefully framed testimonies and stories from people, stories of what was happening and how this wasn't the country that we know. And in fact, one of the members of that panel was Congressman Jim McDermott, the congressman who occupied the seat for 28 years that I now sit in myself. And I can tell you that we were terrified that no one would come to this hearing because we were doing something with communities that really hadn't been engaged before, who really had not stepped forward to tell their stories before. But as we sat there that morning, we watched people stream into the hall, Sikhs with colorful turbans, women in hijab, Latinos and Japanese Americans, allies from faith and labor, neighbors who had seen their neighbors being carted away in the middle of the night, people speaking Spanish and Arabic and Punjabi, people who had believed that their stories didn't matter and that no one would hear them. But that morning, we watched the hall fill and fill and fill. And within 15, 20 minutes, we had 1,000 people there. 1,000 people at the Seattle Town Hall, and an excited NPR reporter reporting on the event said, "We've never before seen a crowd with this diversity in Seattle. People are filling the halls to tell their stories and hear themselves reflected in the stories that are told. And this is what democracy looks like." And it really was an amazing hearing. So amazing that Senator Ted Kennedy heard about it and asked if we would do a similar hearing in the US Senate building, bringing people from all over the country to Washington, D.C. And of course, we said yes. And so here is where the Unitarians come in. Somehow, the day before the big hearing, I was asked to speak. I think it was by Meg Riley. I don't know if everybody knows Meg Riley, my dear friend Meg Riley, to a national gathering of 100 or so Unitarians. Was anybody there by any chance? Okay, because I'm trying to remember how this whole thing happened. So, you can clarify if this is wrong. I said yes, and I went, and I talked about what was happening, about what we needed to do in taking to the streets, about being there in solidarity. I talked about the devastation in our communities and about the people that we were bringing from all over the country to testify. People like an Iranian-American man who was shackled by our government and put on a plane blindfolded for no reason other than his country of origin. An African-American woman whose Pakistani husband had been picked up in the middle of the day without notice to his wife or his children and simply deported back to Pakistan with not a cent in his pocket. And at the end of my comments, a Unitarian minister in the audience stood up and said, "I want us to stand in solidarity in more than just name. We are here in DC tomorrow for this conference, and while we have an entire program planned, I propose that we all suspend the program and get a bus, and that we all go to stand in solidarity with these courageous people tomorrow at your hearing. It is just what we must do." Well, you can imagine at that point, the conference organizer is having a fit. A bit of a minor heart attack because, of course, the whole day was planned and devoted to the conference that people were attending. And so there was a discussion about the proposal. You all voted because that's what we do in this body. And within half an hour, the entire group had decided to turn out for the hearing the next day. The organizing was on to get the buses, and literally everything was moved so that something like 150 people could show up at the Senate hearing the next day, bear witness, and give love to the incredible courage of the people who were telling their stories that day in the Senate. And that was when I realized that UUAs sure can organize quickly. And that I was going to have a lifelong love affair with you in the movement for justice. And I am so honored to say that that has been the case. So thank you, thank you, thank you for all the sustenance and the support and the nourishment. And perhaps there is no more hopeful thing than the light that comes out of darkness. As an organizer, what I know to be true is that strength emerges in times of crisis. It was true after 9/11, and it is true today. And perhaps as an immigrant woman of color who came to this country when I was 16 years old by myself, my parents had $5,000 in their bank account. And they sent me here by myself, an enormous sacrifice that I didn't fully understand the extent of until my son turned 16. And I thought about what that meant to send your kid across the ocean at 16 and know that they might never come back. But there's probably nothing more hopeful than the idea that I could come here with nothing in my pocket, work to build the movement for justice that I believe in, and end up as the first South Asian American woman in the US House and one of only a dozen members of Congress who were born outside of the United States at this time. And I really was not supposed to be a politician. You know, my dad told me there were 3 professions. If you're going to use all your savings and send your kid across the ocean, there are 3 professions that were acceptable. I bet you can imagine what they are. Go ahead, tell me. Doctor, lawyer, engineer. There you go. You got it. So you can imagine my sophomore year of college, we had no money. So we had enough money to make 1 phone call home a year. There was no Skype back then. I'm dating myself. But anyway, there was no Skype back then. And so I used my 1 phone call my sophomore year of college to call my dad and tell him that I was not going to be an economics major. I was going to be an English literature major. And then I had to hold the phone away from my ear like this as he screamed at me and said, I didn't send you to the United States to learn how to speak English. You already know how to speak English. I love my dad, and my dad is proud of me, though he still thinks I'm a minister because he's used to the UK system. So he's like, now you're the minister of which? And they are still in India because I have never been able to bring them here because of our broken immigration system. There is an old Native American proverb, tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. And that proverb, in my belief, guides so much of truly good and beautiful organizing at any level. Because in the telling of the story, as painful as it might be, there is tremendous power. There is the power of connection, but there is also the power of liberation, the power of hearing, the power of being seen, the power of being loved. And in those powers comes the replenishment of the human soul, the replenishment of strength, of courage, of resistance, and resilience. We have built so much in those 17 years since 9/11, and after every major movement for civil rights in this country, entire organizations and infrastructures that didn't exist were put into action. Certainly after 9/11, that happened to tell the stories of Muslims and their contributions to our countries and communities. And how did that infrastructure building exhibit when the first Muslim ban was passed last January? It exhibited by thousands of people rushing to airports across the country. And you can bet that I was one of the first people at SeaTac Airport banging on the doors of Homeland Security, doing what I do so well, causing good trouble, as John Lewis likes to say, making sure that we were holding DHS accountable for what they were doing as they implemented those policies. And then, yes, on my phone, texting all my organizer friends and saying, you better get out here. We need a giant protest and show of solidarity at SeaTac Airport. And so that is exactly what happened, not just in SeaTac, but around the country. And politicians who had never supported Muslims before were now speaking out. I'm proud of our Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, in Washington State, who sued the Trump administration around the Muslim ban. And today, the infrastructure and the work that we've done over the past many decades has meant that we have finally built real bipartisan support for a permanent solution for the 1.8 million dreamers to stay here and have a path to citizenship. And let's be clear about why we haven't brought that bill to the floor. It's because the House Speaker is afraid, because he knows it would pass and it would put a dent in the efforts to use immigrant bashing as red meat to a shrinking base. So how did we build that support? Because of courageous DACA recipients who told their stories in the streets, who went on pilgrimages themselves, people like 22-year-old Graciela Nunez Pargas and 23-year-old Paul Quinones Figueroa and 19-year-old Amy Kelly of Everett, Washington, so many others who live with daily uncertainty and fear in their hearts, but still went into the streets and told their stories with deep courage, opening up without reservation and fighting for change. How did they do it? They organized. They organized with a broad view to justice for all. And that is why they are clear as a bell that they will not trade their freedom for their parents' deportation. That is not a choice that they will make. And today, for the first time, the majority of Americans believe that healthcare is a right and not a privilege. And people took to the streets and the halls of Congress and the phones to defeat Trump Care, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. How? Because they fiercely told stories that resonated all over the country. People like Scott, who told his story of halting his own career and therefore his health coverage because he needed to care for his wife who had early onset Alzheimer's, care that was ultimately provided by Medicaid that was being threatened to be stripped away. People like Jennifer, whose daughter's autoimmune disease caused her heart to fail 4 times before the age of 11, and who had to pay $120,000 for the monthly treatments for her daughter, which was only possible because of what we had gotten to on healthcare, by organizing, building concentric circles of support wider and wider. And let me tell you, I'm a huge fan of the Affordable Care Act, but I am a bigger fan of single-payer healthcare that is provided for everybody. And believe me, I'm not naive. I sit on the House Judiciary Committee and the Budget Committee, and every day I fight a fight that is deeply personal to me as I work to tear down the stereotypes of immigrants as rapists and murderers, and Black and brown people as lazy takers of benefits, and entire African nations classified in words that I can't even mention. I know that this moment in our country's history is grave and that we are in a deeply consequential time in our history. It's not the first and it won't be the last, but it is nevertheless a moment that can feel despairing all too often. And since this is family and we tell the truth in family, and just like they said before I came up here, your wonderful team up here, we have to recognize when we failed so we can do better. We are where we are in part because we failed. And as hard as that is to hear, there are lessons to learn from failures and things that happen out of failure that help us to move forward. But first, we have to recognize that we have failed. We failed because we gave away our power. We allowed corporations and the wealthiest to convince us that somehow our voices don't matter and that the system is too corrupt to make a difference. And so too many people stopped engaging, stopped voting, stopped caring. We failed because we lost faith, sometimes for very good reasons, because too many leaders abdicated in their responsibility to stand forthrightly for the human spirit and soul and goodness, for things that we believe in, and state why we need to do our work unfettered by corporate lobbyists and money in politics, why we need to honor and protect earned benefits like Social Security instead of calling them entitlements. Why we need to think of our entire planet and our farmers when we think about trade, and why no one should be one healthcare crisis away from bankruptcy. We failed because we didn't insist often enough and loudly enough and organize deeply enough to show that the false choices that we're presented with every day are wrong, immoral, and really not a choice at all. It's not about immigrants stealing our jobs, because it's never been about whose jobs. It has always been about more jobs and better jobs. It is not about growing our economy or taking care of people's basic needs, because in fact, there's a very simple truth, which is we're all better off when we're all better off. There is no magical business that gets money without people who have money to spend. So if you increase the minimum wage, it doesn't shut down businesses. What it means is that you increase the amount of money that people have in their pockets to spend to support businesses to succeed. And yes, there are smart ways to do it if we have to make a giant increase, because you know what? The minimum wage, if it were adjusted for inflation, would be at $21 today. And we are at a $7 and change minimum wage across the country, and even less if you considered the tip penalty that gets subtracted out. It's not about exploiting the environment or leaving behind workers, because there is nothing more aligned than protecting our environment, protecting our climate, and protecting our workers. Coal miners do not want their lungs polluted or their families breathing polluted air any more than the next person. They do that work and have done that work because it was required, and they were patriots, and it is we who failed them by not providing a transition to clean jobs, clean energy, more training, and the right kind of work. And it has never been that not talking about race means the problem doesn't exist. Of course it does. It has for centuries. In fact, our country was built on and by racism. That is just true. And we can't get rid of these ideas and mentality unless we talk about it, and talk about it with fierceness and with truth and with humility. And we, people of color and our allies who care about racial justice, also have to understand that we haven't made it very easy for people to talk about race. We've made it even so that those who are racist but are trying not to be are afraid to say anything at all because they might say the wrong thing. So we have to figure out how we call people in even as we call them out. Because if we don't, we hand over a giant wedge issue to those who just want to exploit these fears and divisions and further the politics of racial injustice and resentment. We failed because we allowed the American people to get to a place where too many people cannot even think about thriving because they are so focused on surviving. Just imagine that today, 67% of Americans do not even have $1,000 in their bank account to deal with an emergency. That is a healthcare crisis for your child or for your elderly parent. It is a car breakdown. It is a leak in your roof. It is any problem that requires you to take a week off from work, but maybe you don't get paid because you don't get paid family leave or medical leave or safe and sick days. That's just wrong, and it's why people are so deeply frustrated and angry and resentful, and then easy targets for those who want to use politics of blame for their own advantage. So yes, my brothers and sisters, we have failed. But here's the good news. Failure is sometimes necessary to awaken us. Failure can be our alarm clock. To dig ourselves out from this hole, we have to engage differently. And while we spend a lot of time talking about the message, which is important, it is also about the messengers, communicating person to person, diving in deeply rather than skimming along with platitudes, and understanding that authenticity and integrity are not easily overlooked by any voter. And if you don't have those qualities, it will be overlooked. So for all the horror of the past 15 months, this is incredibly fertile ground for organizing, for digging, for replanting, for sowing seeds and reaping results that are a departure from the past, because we, my friends, are sowing more deeply and with greed-resistant seeds, with human values seeds, with seeds that remind us at the core of who we are as deeply spiritual beings, as people deeply connected to each other and each other's welfare. Failure has taught us that we can't win alone on any issue, and that we have to reject the false choices, and that as proud as I am to be a progressive, and we have a lot of progressives in this room, I'm guessing, and I am proud to be the first vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, that the ideas that we stand for as progressives are not progressive ideas at all. They are not. They are really working families' ideas. And in many ways, they are centrist ideas. Centrist ideas in that we serve the center of our society, not the wealthiest few, but the center of America, our national bedrock, the people whose work sustains us, the people who want to get into the middle class, the people who grow our economy and take care of those who cannot work. The teacher who spends time with our children, more time with our children than any other, but hasn't been compensated for that. Well, not yet anyway. The incredible, courageous teacher strikes are changing that across the country. The domestic workers and the caregivers that take care of our elderly, our homes and our lives with their grace, strength, compassion, and efficiency. The iron workers, carpenters, and laborers who build the foundations that we stand on and live in and work in. The women in every single industry who have faced disrespect and unequal pay, and yet are the glue that holds our society together. The farm workers who pick the food we eat and nourish us every day with their work. The doctors and the nurses who listen to our hearts beating and embrace our innate wellness. The sanitation workers and the parks people, the oceanographers and the scientists, the servers and the artists, those who work in our nonprofits that deal with homelessness and poverty and despair, and the ministers who tend to our souls. Those are the people we need to lift up again. Because as bad as things are, the truth is that we are in the midst of a giant moment in this country when people recognize how important their voices and their leadership are. We are in a moment when the Parkland kids so quickly made the connection between gun violence of mass shootings and tied it to everyday state violence perpetrated on Black and brown people in communities across the country. We are in a moment when the organic women's marches brought us all together and lifted up everyone and declared that we all belong, not without challenges and bumps in the road and things to take care of for the future, but that was, from an organizer's perspective, a platform that propelled so much more, a resistance fueled by love and determination to act and to be in the streets, in Congress, on the phones, in our local workplaces and communities, to be seen. We are in a moment of connection, connecting women to race, race to climate, climate to jobs, jobs to choices around our own bodies. We are in a moment when women, women of color, and LGBTQ folks are not just winning races, they are driving the vote and electing new leaders in Alabama and Virginia and Wisconsin. We are in a moment when Me Too has made the connection real between the abuse suffered by women in Hollywood, very visible, and women who service our restaurants and our hotels. So this is our moment, a moment when we have to use the power that we have and the platforms that we are given to connect people to democracy. Let me tell you, I never thought I would run for elected office. I am an organizer. I have been on the outside. I have been arrested 3 times for leading huge civil disobedience protests. I have been with John Lewis in good trouble. But I ran for office because I realized we were ceding this important political ground, this important organizing territory, that after 15 years of being an activist on the outside, and trying to get people to do the things that we thought would bring us to justice in this country, that it was time to take over the platform of elected office and show how to utilize these offices to build justice and collective power and not corporate or personal power. And so that's why I'm fierce when someone tries to put me down because I'm a woman or an immigrant or a person of color, because you see, those of us that are women of color, immigrant women of color, intersectional is the way we live our lives. I am not a woman on Monday, a mom on Tuesday, a worker on Wednesday, and a, whatever on Thursday. I'm all of those things all of the time. And I have to fight for all of those things all of the time. And so when people try to put me down, they put our ideals of justice down, and they put down everybody who voted for me because of what I stand for and believe in and fight for. And so I don't know how many of you saw that video of Representative Don Young on the floor from Alaska telling me that I didn't know a damn thing about what I was talking about and calling me a young lady. Well, we just had to shut down the floor and get an apology, which I did. And it's why I'm going to refuse in Judiciary Committee to let Attorney General Jeff Sessions or Scott Lloyd, who's the guy that runs the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who wants to go and personally stop young girls, immigrant girls, undocumented girls from making their own choices about their own bodies. That's why we have to call that out. And so, yes, resistance is powerful. We have to resist, we have to persist, we have to reclaim our time. And as a minority party, we are an opposition party. And I'm not talking about political parties here. I'm talking about human parties, human goodness, human dignity. And so that is so important because there is much to resist and oppose, but we can't just be an opposition party. We also have to be a proposition party, and we have to call people in to our vision of the future. What are we proposing that is going to help us to achieve justice for all? And so we tell our stories, and we remember that it is our shared traits of human goodness that ultimately save us. With our stories and our courage and our resilience, we call in everyone that we can. Small businesses, LGBTQ, Black, brown, white, young and old, poor and working class, disabled, and those who have never seen a problem in their lives. We say, come into our world and help us to build a world where everybody can have what they deserve. We ask for the help that we need to see our fear and then walk through it, to be big, bold, and collective, understanding clearly that my liberation is tied up with yours and that nobody wins unless we all win. So yes, there is hope. And I'm an organizer and therefore an eternal optimist. You see, I will never stop believing, and I know you won't either, that love is stronger than hate, and that if politics is the art of the possible, then it is our job in whatever place we sit to push the boundaries of what's possible further and further. I believe in beauty and light and big, bold ideas. And for anyone that might say that we are too idealistic, I would just ask you, in the history of the world, has anyone ever done anything big by thinking small? Did Sojourner Truth? Did Martin Luther King? Did Mahatma Gandhi? Harvey Milk? Nelson Mandela? Rosa Parks? No, they all fought for big ideas, for justice for all and not just for some. And they did it with a deep understanding that it is the collective power of wisdom, of hope and light, beauty, love that always wins. It is the belief that something else is possible, and we cannot allow our justice vision to be dimmed by the challenges that are thrown in front of us. It is the belief that this America belongs to all of us. And so thank you to all of you who minister hope, who give hope to so many. Thank you to every one of you who understands that our hope lies in our growth, our tilling of the soil, and our replanting of the seeds. Thank you to each of you who has taken a risk and done something when no one else would because you knew it was the right thing, and you know that courage is acting when you don't know what the outcome will be. Thank you to all of you who really hear the stories of those who have the quietest voices and then use your voice to amplify those voices. And as His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, the planet does not need more successful people. The planet needs more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of all kind. So thank you for being our peacemakers, our healers, our restorers, our storytellers, and our lovers. This is our country. Let's take it back. Thank you.
My friends, we have time for a few minutes of questions. If you'd like to ask a question of the Congresswoman, I invite you to come forward to the microphone here and ask your question. And as I said, we have a few minutes for these. Please come forward. And if anybody needs assistance moving towards the microphone, let Scott know there, and he will help you with that. Would you like to hold this?
Yeah, I will.
Thank you so much for your very inspiring words. It gives me great pleasure to hear you speak, Representative Jayapal. My name is Beth Wilson. I am a Unitarian Universalist from Bremerton, Washington. Yes, and so I couldn't vote for you, but I would have had I been in your district. And I have a booth out here in the vendor area for Results, which is an organization that's filled with UUs across the nation. Actually, we represent more. There are more UUs than any denomination in the U.S. Involved in volunteering with Results. And we work to end poverty both here in the U.S. and across the world. And we are political. Our job is to create the political will to end poverty. And so I actually came up to thank you first for signing on as a co-sponsor for the Reach Every Mother and Child Act, which you're familiar with, which will improve how USAID invests our national treasure in the prevention of maternal and child death worldwide. And to ask what you think should be our priorities going forward in reducing poverty in the U.S. as well as around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know the work that Results does. I'm so grateful to you. And I really think that, the majority of Americans do not understand how little we spend on these incredibly effective poverty eradication programs around the world. If you ask Americans, a lot of people think that we spend enormous amounts of money on international aid. And so sometimes I say to people who are complaining that we spend too much, I say, okay, I tell you what, you tell me how much you think we spend, and then I will just take half of that. Because the amount that they think we spend is 20%, when in fact it's just pennies. It's just a few percentage points of our total budget that we spend on international programs. So thank you for doing that work. I worked in that area for 10 years. I think that poverty eradication is not one single solution, but certainly I think that making sure that we are investing in raising wages is a huge area. So is investing in mental health, in affordable housing. I mean, we finally this year put money into the budget, which is another process. You should thank the dreamers who got left behind in the budget, because there were two things that the Republicans wanted. One was enormous amounts of defense spending, $670 billion of defense spending. And the second thing they really wanted, was to not do anything about the DREAM Act. And so that gave a lot of leverage to the people on the Democratic side who were negotiating. I ended up voting against the budget, even though it finally increased domestic spending to 2010 levels. So we still have so much work to do on affordable housing. I know you see it here in Portland. It is a top issue in Seattle. And we are not putting enough money into affordable housing. We need to fix our tax system, which is really creating this disparity in wealth. In Washington state, we have the most regressive tax system in the country. But at the federal level, taking $1.3 trillion, transferring it from middle-class workers to the wealthiest, and then 85% of those tax cuts, which have now raised the deficit to $1 trillion for next year, 85% of those tax cuts went to the top 1%. So it's not just income inequality, it's also wealth inequality. And then we have to address institutionalized racism, because as much as many of our programs did for middle-class workers across the country in housing and other things in the 40s and 50s, the truth is there is deeply embedded institutionalized racism that has kept Black and brown wages and benefits for folks of color at a very different scale than even everybody else. So I think it's a multi-pronged solution, but the biggest thing that should underlie that is the belief that if we invest a little bit in helping people out of the places that they're in, that it will benefit all of us a million times over. And so that's what I'm aiming to do. Oh, I forgot one very important thing that is coming up, and that is hunger. The farm bill that we're potentially going to consider the week after we get back to Congress strips out nutrition assistance for families. SNAP, food stamps, these have already been cut. And the farm bill really does deep, deep damage to poverty eradication hunger eradication programs that are contained within the Farm Bill.
Thank you. And Results is working on that as our top priority. Thank you.
So this may be too big a question for a short period of time, but could you briefly tell us some aspects of what positive immigration reform would look like?
Yes, I'll do it very quickly because it's a deep question. But what I would just preface it by is saying that most people do not have any idea of two things. One, that the immigration system is a civil system. It is not a criminal system. That is a very important distinction because it means that nobody gets an attorney, for example. You can get one if you can pay for one. But it has always been established as a civil system. Number two, that we have not adjusted our immigration system in decades. So when people say you should get to the back of the line, there is no line, right? And so positive immigration reform in my mind, and this is broad categories because we don't have a lot of time. Number one, legalization and a path to citizenship for the undocumented immigrants that are in this country. That is essential. The majority of whom have been here for 10 and 20 years. They are folks who have been in the community doing the work that we need. And just remember that you are benefiting from the work. If you eat fruits and vegetables, if you stay in a hotel room, if you have a nanny or get your house cleaned or have an elderly parent that's being looked after, that is the work of immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. So that's the first thing. Number two, we need to rectify the family immigration system, which has been the system that has kept families together, has been a bedrock of how we think about immigration in this country. Right now, even if you are a legal immigrant, legal permanent resident, for example, you will have to wait 20 years, even if you're a citizen, you have to wait 20 years to bring an adult child into this country if you happen to be from the Philippines. So there are these outdated quotas. That's why I could never bring my parents, because from India, it would have taken so long for me to bring my parents to the United States. It took so long for me to get my citizenship. By the time I did to bring my parents, they were so old, it would have been really difficult for them to move at that age. So we need to fix the family immigration system so that it actually meets the needs of our economy and our communities. Third, we need to redo the employment system. Just as an example, right now we actually prioritize industries that are populated primarily by male workers, like tech, even though domestic care, which is populated by female workers, is a place where we have deep shortages in this country. And so if we're prioritizing industries where we have deep shortages, we should be looking at that all over again and redoing it. And then finally, worker rights and protections and civil rights for everybody in this country, and making sure that employers, for example, can't hold hostage somebody because of their immigration status. Things like portability of visas so that you're not tied to one job, but if you get another job and that employer is willing to sponsor you, that you could move. So those are the core elements of a comprehensive immigration reform package.
You are quite spectacular. Thank you very much. I'm the mayor of a small town about an hour east of here, and I work a lot with the folks further east than us. And I haven't heard people preach nearly enough about the call people in, as we call them, out. Folks out in Sherman County think we're a bunch of entitled snowflakes, and I would encourage you to keep raising that for us and for others. If you could talk a little bit more about strategies for not demonizing and realizing how we have failed them folks, and that will bring us closer together.
Well, I think, this is not always easy for me to talk about because there is deep anger around some of the perceived hurts, whether it's due to race or gender or other things. But I think if we can understand that that anger exists for a lot of people in different ways, and we're not in an Olympics, Olympics oppression Olympics. We're not trying to see who can race to the bottom. We're trying to see how we all can rise together. And so when I hear people, and I was on C-SPAN months ago, and this got viral on YouTube and stuff, but this caller called in. They have a Republican line and a Democratic line. I'm a Democrat, in case anybody didn't know that, but And a Republican caller called in, and he was from a Middle Western state, and he was really angry. And he was screaming at me about undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants, he called them, and how they were taking his job, and that's why his son was, didn't have a job anymore, and all these things in his family. And what occurred to me in listening to him, first shock, like he's screaming at me, but I'm kind of used to that. And then secondly, he was so hurt. He was in so much pain. And so what I said to him when he was done is I said, it sounds like you're in a lot of pain. And I don't blame you. I don't blame you because I think we deserted you. We should not have let your town get to the place where it didn't have enough jobs. We should not have let it get to the place where your son doesn't see a future. And you as a parent, I'm a parent. I have a 21-year-old and a 39-year-old. I'm a parent and I want my kids to have a better future than they do. So we failed. And then I said, but you're blaming the wrong people. So I think if we can do this, and it's not always possible, but if we can do this more and more and try to speak to wherever the person's pain is, but not let them off the hook. And I'm looking around this room and, you all in white communities in particular, in rural communities in particular, you have a lot of work to do for us. We can't always be the ones to have these conversations. You need to have the conversations. And my husband is a beautiful white man whose brother-in-law is a Trump supporter and believes that we should shoot immigrants who come across the border. And I can't talk to him. I can love him because he's a family member. But I said to Steve, this is your work, dude. Yeah, you gotta get to work. You gotta have these conversations. And do not tell me that it's too hard because it's family. You don't get to do that. You do not get to do that. You need to have those conversations and back us up so that we're not always the ones trying to have these conversations. And then people say, well, you're just an angry brown woman. We're tired of that. So we deeply need you. And I think the work that you're doing is so important because you are a translator. You are a bridge for us. You are the people who can help bring people to walk over that bridge instead of build a wall. Because we don't need any more walls.
I am so very sorry we don't have time for more questions, but please, let's show the Congresswoman one more time our appreciation for her.
Thank you so much.